for any kind of offender, including violent offenders. But then the critique, I think, was um, that's reactive. That's something that happens after the fact. And so the question is, why are people ending up in such, circumstances where they commit serious violence? And how could they be helped earlier on instead of coming up with all these very costly strategies after the damage has been done by them victimizing someone, but also perhaps they are also victimized and traumatized persons. So I just included in the email some of the government-backed strategies that have been chosen, which tend to be quite reactive and politically motivated approaches, following, for example, a high-profile case where the victim, let's say, is a child, and somebody was out on parole who was a psychopath, and so they came with this violent offender strategy to. It was basically a way of indefinitely detaining whilst also coming up with these treatments. And then I included a video about a man who just got enraged because his kid lost a shoe and ended up killing him. So, what kind of trajectories to violence might these be based on, and whether the treatment approaches that exist today are fit for purpose? Those are the kind of questions I think we wanted to, I guess, brainstorm about. Really, it's not about agreeing with one approach or not, or having a particular kind of view. It's more just what do we think about how we're dealing with violence in general. I think that's what Sam was heading towards anyway. I think if I'm not misrepresenting.
I think like what my feelings were that we were, as we were talking about doing a workshop and trying to like introduce some of the ideas that we've been talking about to new people, like a lot of the questions that come up are like, well, what about the worst case scenario if there isn't a prison? And it's like, yeah, so it's just like really helpful to try and think about more therapeutic interventions and things that are going on, or things that have gone on, and things that have been successful. And so yeah, there was some interesting things on the video that you sent. But yeah, especially the one about the 5 therapeutic interventions. I think there was like a farm type thing in the prison where they brought some animals in. Some of them were quite exotic animals, and like some people, like one guy was saying he'd never seen a cow before. I don't know what, I can't even remember what the animal was now, but and there was some dance therapy. I don't remember hearing from any of the prisoners what that was like, but I'd be interested finding out how that kind of works in practice, and how much people would actually get into it, because I think it's a really good idea. It's just also quite hard to imagine like loads of people in prison dancing like a tree or something like. And then like drama therapy, and like that's like, it's like really, I think that's really exciting. So there was 2 more. Oh yeah, what were the other 2? Can you remember?
Yeah, there was the finance program.
Oh yeah.
And there was the horse training as well.
Oh yeah.
And there was the Buto as well.
What was that?
There was the Buto at the end, that self-empowerment playing out your inner devil or something.
Yeah, that was the like dancing one, I think.
Yeah, that's it. Dancing, Butoh. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Did anyone? Who got to watch the videos?
I did get to watch some of them. I found the psychiatry one. I didn't really interact with it that well because it was just this guy talking, and it was very short as well as no examples, and yeah, so I didn't really understand what that was. I think there's much better videos around what therapy might entail, and what has been successful. You know, it would be good to sort of see what's been successful in. The problem is, yeah, is it getting it before people get to the point where they become criminals or get labeled as criminals, you know, arrested, charged, whatever. But it may be, in a sense, prison, because some people say prison actually is sometimes the place where prisoners are identified as needing help, whereas before they've been going through their lives maybe not being diagnosed as dyslexic or noticed that they've got mental health issues, or that they're violent for no reason, or, you know, all these things and that's where parents, you know, need help as well. In, you know, society needs to and it is. So I was watching a YouTube video today, and they were saying, I mean, this is a sweeping statement, but someone said, "Oh, it was one of those chat shows in America where people are talking about, you know, things, and this guy stands up and says, look, you know, because he's an older generation, so his generation's had to fight, you know, racism, all this stuff, and then he says what the world actually lacks now is a sort of spiritual base that people are brought up in, because a lot of people aren't brought up anywhere near any sort of guidance as to what is good, what is wrong, you know, what is right, what is wrong, subject to all sorts of abuse that's not noted, that's not looked at, dealt with, and then often those, you know, what makes a person into someone who ends up in prison. And then, of course, you got all the white collar stuff as well. I mean, I'm not just saying it's just people in the ghetto as such. It goes all the way up. Because, you know, say abuse is not necessarily just assigned to the working class either. So actually, we're all subject to the sort of stuff that the upper and middle classes get as well, because their definitions then filter down to us, and we're labeled with the terms from the American Book of Diagnoses, which then labels people further, and people get into cycles of, I don't know what I'm going a bit on a bit here, really.
No, I understand. I think last time we were on Zoom, it was just the four of us, Sam, Ella, myself, and Kate. And we were talking about the significance of community, which is what the spiritual aspect that you mentioned. There are societies where no matter what their troubles, they just don't have the kind of issues we have. So we have women, for example, when they give birth, they are supported by the neighborhood. They never raise the child by themselves, so you don't see postpartum depression or psychosis that leads to harming the infant, for example, in ways that you see here in the Western world, where everybody's just sort of left alone, and you have to get back to work, and you have to kind of, I don't know, navigate everything on your own, and there's financial burden over there. in those societies, like I come from East Africa, no matter what people have, they share. And that kind of community just doesn't leave you feeling generally alone and unaccounted for. And that's the trauma that you've talked about. You know, a lot of people with need end up in prison, sometimes because they're it's a cry for help, but it is a criminalized cry for help, and they end up in prison. And you wonder how many people would not be there if they just had a community to look after them, and a kind of, I don't know, some kind of anchor to social bonds. There are always going to be very violent people, no matter what you do, but the prison system isn't full of very violent people. It's full of very vulnerable people, some of whom are violent, but it's generally vulnerable people who have been let down. And you mentioned white collar crime. If you really want to talk about harm, let's talk about white collar crime in terms of actual harm that affects masses of people. So yeah, I agree with what you're saying. A lot of the times those things aren't considered. It's just a sort of a reactive policies or therapies after it's all been done and said, and it's a bit too late.
Yeah. Well, I suppose one of the issues is with the more richer criminals, they can afford to, have lawyers and things like that. So, and afford therapy as well, private therapy. So you have this two-tier system, justice system.
Yeah.
And then our politicians do their best to wreck the community, or not deal with the issues as well, like addiction. I think addiction plays a big part as well, which is, where Darren works with Renew and stuff.
Yeah.
And
there's sorry, Lee, are you recording this, my friend?
Yeah.
Thank you, mate. Well, also, like, there's also addiction to violence. It's a very real thing.
What is that?
Addiction to violence. It's a very real thing. Yeah, and I've just been rereading a few of the articles I've had the pleasure of reading over the last few months, and this these couple of lines here really stood out to me. In modern working class male cultures, violence, skill, and a willingness to fight became characteristics that elicited the degree of appreciation and respect. For young men, violence was a topic of wonder and gossip. It inspired schoolboys to construct mythical matchups and neighborhood hierarchies of violent capacity. Even adult and ostensibly respectable men treated violence itself as something truly awesome, in return of an incomprehensible real that should be treated with a degree of reverence, something brutally powerful that existed beyond language. And that sums up my experience. I was taught from a very young age, you get out there and you cause harm to them people if they've done anything wrong to you. And I can remember being very young, 6-7-year-old, discussing with my friends, the hardest men on the estates, and we'd wait for him to leave the pub late on a Friday night, the local pub, because we know there'd be ultra violence there, and we'd all be waiting in anticipation for all the drunk adults to leave and start fighting. It was just so exciting, and I don't know where that comes from. I don't know whether that's ingrained within us. If I'm capable of it, you guys are capable of it. You know what I mean? It's a very human trait. And it was just such a big part of my culture.
How old were you, Darren?
I'd have been between 5, 6, and 7. Yeah, yeah. It was just part of it. It was just part of it. It was just, yeah. It was just part of it, and like we said, like what worked for me was I was lucky I got addicted to heroin, so like any like violent notion was just medicated from me. Like I just started taking heroin, and any I just didn't have the urge to fight people anymore, get aggressive with people anymore.
So it was like a way to get out of that culture, you know, without having to leave it, because it's difficult to leave some cultures, isn't it? They almost become like, this is our gang, our little cult or whatever, and what we say goes, and if you don't do it, you could be subject to that beating yourself. So it's like you just run as a gang. I mean, where I grew up, we were playing football in a cul-de-sac, so the whole street, and it was very much a mixture. But some people complain, like the woman who had her house there because we kept kicking her window with the ball. But it was like we had disabled kids as well, so we allowed them a kick of the ball. You know, it's like because we had a girl with liver disease, but she still came because everybody there was a community. So the kids played there, and we played there all the time, actually, for a few years until we grew out of it, obviously. But girls, boys, everyone, and it was a way to let off steam. So, and it was a way for girls to be quite physical and play football without it being, oh, it's a big thing, girls wanting to play football. We were just playing in our school uniforms or dresses or whatever, and I think everyone needs a way to let off steam. And if you get led in a groove, it's quite exciting. As for us, my mum would have killed us if we got into any trouble. So we were very much looked after in that sense. We had, we could not misbehave. My parents were very, very strict, and we were also foster kids. So if we misbehaved, we'd get sent back to the dreaded children's home or whatever. The sort of gates, you could see the sort of Addams Family gates, and it's all whip you into shape or whatever. No, you had these. It's crazy, but it's like the big bogeyman. All the big bogeyman will get you, or something will get you. But I think boys as well need very physical, especially if you've got, because violence is activity, isn't it? It's very intense. I mean, I used to go to judo, actually, and that was another release. Judo, although it's a gentle art, you don't kick. But, I think maybe, and I went to a boxing club in Leeds, and I thought that was a really good club because it was about training. So you train it, you punch in a bag, you do fights, but you have all the guards on. And there's one in Hull as well. And I think you do need some of those sorts of things. Anyway, I'll shut up because I think Andrew wants to say something.
No, not particularly, but there are several. It seems to me there are several boxing clubs in Hull. There's certainly a hell of a lot more than one. But I've always wondered whether that encourages more violence than it helps kind of sublimate or direct. But I don't know the arguments about that.
You remind me of Carl Jung.
What was that, Maren? Did you say something, Maren?
Yeah, Sam, you go first, and I'll talk about this.
No, go ahead. Go for it. You go for it.
I'm just listening to you talk about letting off steam, especially with boys. I think it's more about with all human beings, because there is this very, very influential psychoanalyst called, you would have heard of him, Carl Jung. He's the guy that talks about archetypes, which is the collective unconscious that leads to mythology and religion. There is a reason why different societies that have never been in contact with one another just come up with similar symbols. They think there's a God up there, and they build, all these symbols. It's because it's not just you and your conscious mind. There is also a collective consciousness. And he talks about, in addition to your conscious self, there is an unconscious that he calls the shadow. And the shadow is everything about you that you don't like, that you suppress. So it starts early on when you're a kid. Somebody yells at you for doing something that a kid does, and it might be, I don't know, talking too much or being really active or whatever the case may be. We learn from early on to just push certain things that are considered undesirable, and that can become the shadow, and it can become dangerous unless you recognize it and integrate both the good aspects and the bad aspects of yourself. And so from that point of view, people sometimes they lash out because everything's been accumulating, kind of like put aside, this shadow version of themselves. And then eventually, that's going to really show up itself without you being prepared for it. It's going to overwhelm you. And sometimes people are overwhelmed by rage. Like when you see these mass shootings, that is unrecognized or unintegrated shadow, to use his terms, that kind of just makes people snap. Instead, you should progressively let things out and acknowledge that you have this. We all have it. It's not the case that it's some people are strange or masculine or different. I think I think it might manifest by either being aggressive to others or being aggressive to yourself, which is what happens when people are suicidal as well, I think. So it just reminded me of that when you said how important it is to let people let off steam. And that's what martial arts is doing. It is letting you use it productively or constructively, so that you would never use violence unless you need it. But you're kind of teaching yourself to know that if it comes to it, you would, but you're disciplined enough not to use it. So yeah, anyway, it just reminded me of that.
No, it's just the honor, because when you do judo, you have to bow before you go on to
Exactly.
dojo. So this is an element of respect for
Mhm.
your opponent as well. So when you,
Yeah.
so it's a fight with rules, really.
Mhm.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi.
I'm so glad you could get on. I'm in the middle of feast preparation, and it just completely slipped my mind. So I'm just so glad you're there. I might have to go in a minute, but I'll sit in the van for a little bit. Apologies.
That's fine. We
Good to see.
managed.
I went to see my old mate's boxing match the other day in Newcastle, and it was just like absolutely wild in there. It was like a D-Day. It was like it was just like fight after fight after fight with the like big shiny auction in the middle, and just like the whole culture was just like absolutely steaming with like I don't know, just like macho, like cocaine field, like party. I don't know. It was just absolutely wild, but still like the culture of it. Like while they were actually fighting, they were all being like, it's like it is about having respect. It is about winning, but it's also about like having respect and I think I have some complicated feelings around like whether how much it perpetuates the culture of violence that it comes from, but it's also like yeah, I think it's an interesting thing. There's a couple of things I was gonna like string onto, but I won't talk for too long. But one was like this book. I was reading this book, Warp and Weft by Lisa Finnan, and it is really, really amazing. It's about basically looking at trauma from a really much more holistic view of it than how it's framed within the medical world, where it's about like training your thoughts, and it's about like behavior change without looking at the root causes. And so this book is just about like loads of different body up and head down approaches to like dealing with trauma. And I just remember one of the bits they were talking about, something that you were talking about, Darren, like this addiction to violence, the addiction to these like high adrenaline emotional states, where it's like when you're in that state quite a lot, when you like your adrenal glands are going quite regularly, and like you've got a lot of cortisol in your system, it's like you get really used to that, and everything below that level of excitement, it just starts becoming a bit depressing and a bit like flat. And so it's like it's like people don't feel alive unless they're in that state regularly, if once it's like an addiction. And I can't remember what she said about finding ways out of that cycle. I didn't read all of it thoroughly, but it's a really good book. It'd be worth I'll try and find some chapters for one of these sessions sometime. But another thing, just one more thing, like that comes back to one of the videos you sent, Maren, about the not the therapeutic interventions, the serious violent offenders.
Yeah.
I guess it just like a lot of that video was like, it was very like top down. We're gonna rehabilitate these people who are different. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's very like coming from a very professional point of view, with like with and even the terms like anger management or like self-regulation and things like this is like it's like about control, and it's even just of your own body. It's like and it's as if your head's separate from your body, and your thoughts are separate from your emotions. And something in this book that she was like emphasizing was this, like, everything is totally one thing. And it's and if we see it like management, it comes from this place of understanding like people to be superior to other life, and mind to be superior to body, and men to be superior to women, and all these things about like and I think and it's interesting because it's like how it actually plays out in real life, like just the use of language is like is part of this like big separation between communities being more in control of dealing with serious violence, and charities or official kind of like official organizations being in control of dealing with the violence. And they're just like they're totally different ways of like approaching it, and one of them has a lot more empowerment involved and like long-term change, I think, which is the community level approach to it. Anyway, I'm gonna start. I'm rambling now, but someone else can speak for it.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah. With the addiction to violence and adrenaline rush that you talked about, there are a lot of authors at the moment who aren't religious, who are not for religion, but understand the role religion played in giving people purpose, the role community gave people this sense of purpose. And I wonder, there are a lot of commentators at the moment talking about lack of purpose is what leads to that restlessness. And this is not from an academic point of view, just people discussing in the political, I guess, arena maybe, that yeah, what you mentioned, Sam, about just the need for this adrenaline rush through violent acts, perhaps is something that is a symptom of a life that doesn't have any particular purpose. Because I think purpose itself requires that kind of effort and energy expenditure, and maybe that is a part of this problem as well. So I don't know what the alternative is, but yeah, maybe it's modernity, maybe it is lack of community, maybe it is lack of things that held people together, even though they're not particularly totally great, like religion, that is kind of being replaced by this need to feel, I guess, through violent means, I suppose.
Do you think is it addiction to the anger?
Linus, I think Kate's got her hand.
Oh, sorry, Kate.
It's
Yeah.
okay.
No, I mean, what occurred to me is like a lack of purpose and also meaning in life, because like part of being human, I think, is to find meaning in the things that happen to us, in our sort of our life narrative and everything, and given that like everything that's been in our sort of world, the stories that we're told about who we are as human beings as being inherently selfish, that we'll take if we get the chance, and that meaning is like being a tool of the machine, of the system, rather than actually having that sort of connection to each other. In fact, it's I guess that bigger system, it wants anything but us to connect to each other and find a way that we don't need to be part of that machine in the same way, and that we can get more by sort of collaborating and looking after each other and being mutuality with each other and everything. It feels like it's part of a sort of a lie of what it means to be a human being and relationship with each other almost. It feels like with this group, it's like part of that process is learning, unlearning that, and learning how to be in relationship with each other, in collaboration with each other, and love with each other, out of not fear. And yeah. Maybe that is part of the solution, that and yeah.
Yeah. If no one has anything, again, you remind me of a theorist. I'm gonna add who you remind me of, Kate. I'm sure you probably know this, but this famous sociologist called Durkheim talked about the way society is more important than biology, that even something that you think is biological, like suicide, is not really. It's more social than biological. So he shows an example about this by saying close-knit communities have less suicide. It's not because it's because that group cohesion protects people. And then those who aren't close-knit communities, and they're very much about individual liberty and all that, tend to have high rates of suicide because of disconnect. And so disconnect, lack of purpose, and this kind of aloneness, the individual is sovereign, and just focusing on that. So he shows that the suicide rate amongst Catholic countries is less than Protestant countries, because Catholics are very much about just the submission to God, and you're not really allowed to question, and so everybody's kind of within this community setting. And then Protestants encourage more individual liberty type of thing, so they have higher suicide rates. And then Jews have even lower than Catholics because of what happened to them. They're more close-knit. So I wouldn't say religion is the solution, because religion is also being used to put down a lot of populations and a lot of minorities and a lot of women. But it's more just that fabric, that social fabric that brings you together. I don't think it's religion that was a positive factor. I think it's the excuse for connection that a religion gave people to connect. And so we're getting rid of religion more and more, but I don't know if we replaced it with something else to keep us connected, as you say, Kate.
I was thinking recently, because there's been loads of stuff. I went on a webinar in Leeds, and it was about basically the stabbing of I think he was 11, this boy, African boy. And a lot of people were on this webinar, like there was leaders of the, and there was a lot of things that I noticed. One thing was the African community working with the Caribbean community, because there was a disconnect in terms of the history of slavery and the whole history, well, colonialism as well, which unites the Caribbean and Africa, but also divides it in terms of the divide and rule that the whole thing engendered. And it's still going on with some of the policies that come from Europe and impact communities here and abroad as well, because that impacts on how prisoners are treated as well. And in terms of violence, it's, I mean, one thing that, because they had a mixture of young people and the older people, and the young people were saying, well, what have you got for us teenagers? Because these are the young men who then, and say like in the Jewish tradition, they at 13 they'd have a bar mitzvah, which is a sign, it's a sort of coming of age, I'm sure in the East African communities there's certain traditions, whereas if you reach a certain age as a boy, a young man or a girl, you go through certain, I mean, I'm not saying all of them are, because I certainly don't like some of the the FGM type, which was also considered a coming of age type of, no, it wasn't actually, because it was done very, very young, wasn't it? But certain traditions, but it is like, because we have gone away from the established church because they've committed so much abuse as well in the name of religion, and they've messed up a lot of people's lives, especially Catholics actually. And then in Protestants, they've then gone the way of joining in with secular society, so they're, it's okay to pray for a new washing machine, but not for your neighbor down the road that needs some food. It's all a bit skew if some of Jesus's messages or Allah's messages even as well, so people interpret the religion in the way they want, so you have to look at there's pros and cons, isn't there? If we have no religion, we have communist Russia or China. It was interesting because I talked to 3 Chinese women the other day in an art gallery, and I'd painted this picture innocently, actually, called Neptune, which is, and I didn't even realize, I didn't know much about why I was painting Neptune, but he's a figure that is in, and I had to explain who Neptune was, and I actually did a very bad job of it, really. So I thought, well, why am I using, and then I had to look him up, and he's actually a Roman god, and the Greek god is Poseidon, and there's all these, and they're myths. they're fairy tales. But you go back to the Roman Empire, they had, you know, all sorts of gods going on. And you know, but what we want really is something to connect us. And I like that, you know, like some of Kate's stuff has been like connecting to the earth, connecting to growing food, green, protecting forests, rivers. You know, there's a lot to do, but it's having that purpose. Because at the moment, I suppose climate change, you don't want it to be considered as a religion, but in a sense, it's a purpose, and you could say it's God's purpose we need to actually, we've come to revelations in the Bible, certainly, so we need to actually sort out the earth. And if we focused on that, actually, we wouldn't focus on beating each other up because you call me this, you call me that, trigger, and we beat each other up and we forget about the earth. You know, there's an element of we waste time being violent, using anger. And who's taught us to do that? Who's taught us to use anger, and who's equated anger, say, with men, or usually men? But what do women get out of being, you know, angry? When women are angry, it really terrifies me because I just think it just contravenes everything that a woman not that women can't be violent, you know, in a context of, say, like the Woman King, being a warrior, fighting for the US Army, fighting in the British Army, having those skills to defend our country, you know. But what is violence really for, you know? And I suppose a lot of it is for wars, or, you know, we have soldiers, but it's trying to sort of have some sort of discipline and commitment to humankind and us being the best people that we can be living on the earth. But I mean, the 7 deadly sins of sort of, they're there, you know. Greed is the big, religion, material wealth, ownership, megalomania, control of the world. You know, you can see that. You can see elements of that in Microsoft and the way that, and the medical profession as well. I've actually got a big distrust of doctors now who have to abide by a Hippocratic oath that they no longer believe in. You know, doctors have become the mad scientists of the future that we saw in science fiction films.
They're good predictors.
And they've cut out all natural medicine, so they don't. The NHS does not endorse chiropractors, naturopaths, herbal practitioners. Basically, they won't bring them into the fold because big pharma, its hands and control of doctors, nurses, everyone in the health service as it stands, which is why it's in crisis.
Yeah,
actually, because no one, it's supposed to be healing the sick, and I don't see that. And I don't see the attitudes in either the staff, the doctors, and the nurses. It's been lost, and that's really sad. The compassion and the fact that if you're a nurse, you've got a position of power. If you're a doctor, you've got a position of power, and patients hang on your every word. And so if you get labeled a violent psychopath, can you really believe is that your diagnosis? You know, are we going to diagnose everyone psychopaths or extreme?
it kind of is like that, yeah.
And also, I started off talking about how they see men and black men, say, and black and white men, and black men have always been seen to be very aggressive, even if they do nothing. It's just, you know, this sort of stereotype in the head. And also any big man, you know, is suspect to, oh, I wouldn't want to get messed up with him. You know, he might be the gentlest person on earth. Never. In fact, I met a really tall, you know, really, you know, well-built guy, dancer. He was almost 7 feet tall. He was a dancer, the gentlest person, but he kept getting picked on because people wanted to fight him and beat him. Because it's like, oh, there's a guy I want to, and that's that competitive spirit that some men have towards each other. You know, oh, I've got to beat this guy up. Where does that come from? That culture of men having to fight, you know, in a civilized for dominance, like in the animal kingdom, in a sense. It's like, you know, are we just animals? The bottom line.
Yeah, we are. Yeah.
I believe Kate has.
Oh, sorry, Kate. Yeah, sorry.
I guess, yeah, just responding to some of that, it feels, you know, when you were talking about 7 deadly sins and stuff like that, I just think there are stories that are told about who we are as human beings that are lies, frankly. And it's like megalomania, all of that. It's like, yes, some, but the minority. And I think it's time to stand up and step outside that and actually embrace who we actually are, which is generous and wanting to like be able to contribute and help each other. And it's at times of crisis that you see that that is what our
Yeah.
human nature is, because people step up and not back, they step up. And it's actually the sort of the status quo, the vested interest in keeping us separate and telling this story about us in order to control us, that steps in. You know, I felt great hope in lockdown when, you know, I mean, we'd literally screened a film 2 weeks before called it was called The Response, and it was around Hurricane Marina in God, can't remember the country. And it was how mutual aid, you know, everything sort of popped up during that period. And our question at that point was, how can we have mutual aid without the disaster 2 weeks before the lockdown? And then we immediately saw how communities stepped up. And so I just feel like it's like, and you know, the whole thing within the NHS, there's no doubt, I feel that the way everything is set up, it's set up for us to be in competition with each other, but that is also a lie. It's like, so how we build that, the weaving and the relationship stuff is essential, because we put ourselves in boxes. It's like how you act in a particular role and everything else. Anyway, I could ramble on about this for hours because I'm flipping passionate about it, but the other thing that struck me as you were talking is like Ernie, which is another of the project ideas fund projects, is clinicians within the NHS who are standing up and going, we do not agree with this medicalisation of distress. And their project is all about clinicians actually telling their stories of the madness of the mental health system and what they're dealing with within it and the trauma they're experiencing being part of it. And it feels like with this project, you know, there's an amazing opportunity in Hull linking together to actually start challenging these narratives.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. Lee, would you like to speak, my friend?
Yeah, can you hear me, everyone?
Yeah.
No, it's been very interesting. I've just been sat here listening and actually, for the most part, feeling nothing but fear. I wanted to, interject and say something, but I'm finding it fascinating. There's a lot of, I think actually, Merrin is, I believe, hi Merrin, I've met you for the first time. There's a good reason for it. There's a good reason why I haven't been able to. I'm quite often not allowed to. Not allowed. Don't allow myself to talk. But because it's for suffering that shadow you was talking about earlier. I have this fear, and actually. So just to give you a little bit of background, you know, I went to prison at a very young age, and it was because of anger, temper problems. I had anger problems. I had a lot of rage because I was abused by my father for the best part of 10 years up until the age of 15. I'd suffered a lot of violence at his hands. And it's quite often why I wasn't taught to speak to anyone about anything. In fact, quite the opposite. I was beat up and told to shut up. And it led me to feeling a good 30 years of rage, and it big in and out of prison as a youngster, having addiction problems. And actually, I just wanted to say, a very important point that Glynis brought up, which was, at the hands of the doctors, people being misdiagnosed and just being given labels. I was never diagnosed with so much that I suffer with until later on in life. In fact, only in the last 2 or 3 years, finding out myself through organisations like Let's Talk. But again, they were terrible with just giving you a diagnosis. Again, all they did is say you've got PTSD complex. I knew that, by the age of 48, I knew I had this, and it was all stemmed to being a child, before the age of 15, like I said, and then being introduced to prison was obviously, it was a violent place. You had to play up to it, if you like, In fact, the first day I was introduced to prison, I was in a fight with someone, and then got put in segregation. It's kind of like, and anyway, I wanted to say something about another environment that I was in as well, which was what was the old mental health hospital, Delapole. So I'd have been 17 years old on a section in Delapole for, in quotes, being a perpetual offender, when I hadn't been to prison. I hadn't been to prison before I'd been there. But while I was in there, it was a very volatile situation, in that there was lots of kids just like me who came from abusive backgrounds and had been abused. My best friend in there, a lovely black lad I remember called Ian. He was a very intelligent guy. He was put on HMP in Delapole. So, in other words, he couldn't have been let out until Her Majesty said so. He'd basically... So, and he ended up doing 5 years on a locked ward. Delapole was a locked... he was locked up more than you're locked up in prison. It was 23 hours a day he was locked in there. It was very strict. But was basically what it was a lot of kids that had, explosive tempers because of where they'd come from. And actually, it was just a matter of time before, you got so pent up. You knew everyone was going to kick off in turn. You just didn't know when. So it was a very volatile, very stressful, but, we all banded together. We was all very close to each other. But I don't know. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but I do think the doctors, that's a big problem. Like Glynis said, they've got some part in this. I feel it because for years and years I had a lot of depression problems, but I don't feel like they was bothered about that, but they would be bothered about giving me these chemical drugs, and not looking at all the other alternative solutions, I felt very ignored by them. I did do for best part of 4 or 5 years. The last, so many years of my life, I feel very angry that the fact that they just give me or kept me addicted to painkillers. But then there was never any sort of follow-ups. I just think there's a big responsibility there. There's a big gap there. Again, I love the fact that he's talking about, things like nature and calming, but then again, having places to vent. It's all been said really, but I've just been listening, and I just wanted to participate, if you like. But yeah, so I'm looking for solutions, and I think for me, it's personally for me, it's water, nature, being around or on water, in water. Yeah, you know, I've always been very, very fearful of violence, very fearful of violence, because it's because so many times in my life, you know, well, as I say, very young life, with my temper problems, but you know, I'd lose everything. You know, I could lose everything in an instant. You know, and I learned that at a very young age. I'm very fearful of walking out on the streets because I don't feel like I can defend myself. I've had chronic pain most of my adult life. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there. I don't know. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke.
Thanks
Mary,
for
would you like to
sharing,
speak?
Luke.
Yeah, thank you, Lee, for sharing your story. I'm just agreeing with everything you're saying and also kind of taking notes of everything you're saying. And it just seems like you have a child who's failed by the institution of family, who's then failed by the institution of the medical sector, who's then failed by the state, and then on top of that, being punished for being distressed, and distress being criminalized. You know, the label of repeat offender at such a young age is so powerful. And it reminds me of a couple of things. One is the psychiatrist called Thomas Szasz, who was anti-psychiatry. He was a psychiatrist himself, but he thinks that society needs scapegoats. Back in the day, it used to be witches, and you burn them at the stake. You kind of take everything that's problematic about your society and you transfer it to a group. And then the church was replaced by psychiatry, and witches were replaced by mentally ill persons. And who we decided is going to be mentally ill is the power dynamics that you can that it reveals. So institutional psychiatry is problematic because, first of all, it's not that they identify a disease pathway. A mental illness is what a psychiatrist says it is. And so another psychiatrist could diagnose you with a different mental illness. It's a very subjective, you know, and very power related relationship with a patient. When I said something similar to this in a platform, I was attacked by psychiatrists DMing me saying, "What do you know about psychiatry?" And they tend to be quite violent because you can't criticize the institution of psychiatry that has been quite coercive. And it's not been about healing and therapy and rehabilitation and restoration of anything positive. It's just been about nobody or these people don't feel this narrow definition of what well-being is, and so they're going to be kind of controlled and pathologized and institutionalized. And Thomas Szasz is criticizing that by saying, or was criticizing that by saying, it's not that the symptoms don't exist. So it's not that depression or schizophrenia or bipolar don't exist. It's that they should not be pathologized. They should be seen as a normal reaction to your environment. So if a 17-year-old is behaving the way that you described, Lee, having gone through that, that's not something you pathologize. That's something you accept as a normal reaction to that kind of environment. Because when you institutionalize people, they alter their behavior. And so there are all kinds of experiments about this. If you put people in prison, if you put people in a mental institution, they behave in a way that fits that institution, and they completely alter as human beings. So I just listening to that story, I'm just noticing different instances where a young person was just constantly let down, and then everybody's sort of just like transferring responsibility to somebody who actually, from where I'm standing, you know, is victimized. So I'm not a fan of institutional psychiatry. I do recognize there are psychiatric symptoms that should be approached from a healing perspective, and Kate talked about the medical model being really about pills, basically, not really healing or improving quality of life or recognizing the issues. So yeah, I was just noting all of these things from Lee's conversation with us. So that was, yeah, thank you for sharing. And I'm sorry about all these not fit for purpose institutions. And one last thing about the rage also. Is only recently I'm also recognizing how rage is available in everybody. Like I had a middle class upbringing. For me, it was home, church, school. So it was that kind of, strict middle class upbringing. And you wouldn't think somebody like me would develop any rage, but you recognize how much over time you accumulate all kinds of, you need to do more, you need to achieve more, like even just from your parents, let's say, that actually you end up with this unchecked rage about how much you've had to deal with, to put up with, to let go, to be burdened by. So this thing about rage is actually more common than you think. It's not just if you're obviously physically abused or anything like that. I think it's just also available in people who just keep taking on little things at a time that eventually, I think, accumulates. And we are all capable of rage. So yeah, let's admit that, I suppose. Stop.
Thank you, Merryn. Glynis, would you like to speak now?
Yeah, I was going to respond to Lee's. Yeah, thank you, Lee. That was really brave of you to share all that, actually. And yeah, it got me thinking too, because I was in the care system to a certain extent, but then it sort of felt like it wasn't, because I was fostered with a family. But immediately I was fostered, I was part of the social care system because I was a looked after child, and we had a regular social worker visits. And I was thinking about the social worker the other day. She used to race up in her Triumph convertible, all blonde hair, glasses. She looked like Dame Edna a little bit, a young Dame. And yeah, so, and also my experience working in a psychiatric ward, which almost made me go mad. And I think I should have said more then, but I remember, like, every chance I got, I said to people, do not get embroiled in the mental health service, no matter how much they claim to help you. I had a friend who was suicidal. They gave her a bottle of 100 antidepressants, enough to kill her. It's so. And then I worked on a psychiatric ward, and we didn't have access to anyone's notes like you do if you're a nurse on a general ward. You get access to patients, you know what's wrong with them. It's part of you need to know about your patients. With the psychiatric we were just told, right, you have to all we did was give out medicines, and really strong. I looked them up. I did get, and on that ward, as a student nurse, we'd got no tuition on how to deal with any of these patients except go and sit with them. And most of the nurses, a lot of them used to sit and smoke with the patients, and all the patients. And I remember we had these circles where people were supposed to talk. There was a couple of psychiatrists, and I just remember looking around the room and saying every one of them is on chlorpromazine, haloperidol. These are the old style. I think they've changed some of them now, but everyone was like zonks. And how can you have a group discussion when people are just zonked out of their heads? And there was no treatment, and we were like kept out. So we're students coming in with, can we help people? And it's like, shh, it's all. They didn't know what they were doing, basically. And this is, I trained in London, and opposite the hospital I trained in was the Maudsley Hospital. Now, the Maudsley was the epitome of psychiatry. It got a lot of funding, mainly from Arabia, actually, Saudi Arabia, because they used to fund it. They funded a lot of the research that went on in King's College Hospital, which is now on TV. When I went to it, it was a bit of a dump. It was in need of some funding, I must admit. But yeah, the whole profession. And when I was a nurse, the reason I left was because I was just doling out tablets, and half of the tablets were to counteract the side effects of other tablets. So the medical and in a teaching hospital, they treat patients really badly because they crowd medical students around, talk about, you know, anything from death to cancer, when the patient might be in for a really simple operation and they're frightened to death by the time the students have left. And it's like the way this treatment, I remember working on a gynae ward, and in the end I resorted to drawing cartoons of the staff because I had to distance myself and actually make everything into you either laughed or you cried, and you couldn't work there anymore. So I think, and you can't criticize too much, because you can't say, well, the NHS is there, you know, it's this, but I think it's actually gone beyond, you know, because even when I worked there, you know, that was 82, our nursing tutor said the patients come first, but they don't anymore. You know, big pharma and money and how much time you're spending, can't sit down and talk. I used to talk a lot, actually, because I found that talking to patients when they're in hospital was a much better way, and they actually got better quicker and were out of the hospital, freeing up a bed for the next person. And so actually kindness and compassion and actually treating patients holistically, except for the food. And actually doctors' food diet didn't come into their training until the 90s or something like that, after I'd, you know, and the food was the worst thing. So you've got diet as well. I mean, my mum brought us up on frozen food because it was the rage when it came out in the 60s and 70s. So we grew up, but at least we had veg, you know, and we had reasonable foster parents who didn't beat us up. You know, my mum was very strict, but there was no like beatings and real, I'd say they treated us really well. But someone like Lee's family, they should have been reported, and, you know, Lee should have been, the father should have been, you know, disciplined, something. They should have got family therapy. And this is the thing about adoption. You see the difference between adoption and foster. We were fostered. He was adopted because his family were rich, you know, so they could really afford not to have the grants from the adoption agency. But, you know, it also meant they had no supervision, because, you know, they had no social workers coming down to get, how are you getting on, Mr. and Mrs. Palmer, with your foster child, with your adoptive child? You know, is it fine? Are you getting, there should be people to help. And that was the you know, that was.
I didn't realize it was adoption.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and it's, you got paid to foster. You get much more money now. You didn't get that much money then.
Yeah.
Fostered, but
Linus, there's someone else waiting to speak. Could you round up what you've got to say, please? Have you finished?
Yeah, I suppose Lisa's story always affects me more because it's similar, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Okay, thank you. Right then, Sam.
Yeah, just something you were just like talking about having conversations in hospital, Linus, and that being really helpful. And it just reminded me of a question I wanted to just ask. Since we watched those videos about therapeutic interventions, like I was thinking about if anyone had any other things that they'd come across that were kind of like relatively well organized as like therapeutic interventions. Yeah, whether it's like in prison or outside prison.
I did some cycle training once, and we went to this special school. It was part of cycle safety, and we went to this school where the kids there, they were kids whose parents had, murdered each other, or they were murderers, and they had this amazing, because they'd ride along railway tracks, try and race trains and stuff. So it was amazing working with that group, and the fact that doing something active, cycling, was really good. And photography, when I've taken students out, not violent ones obviously, but I think something that engages people as a creative, and it allows you to go places. If you've got a camera, you can go into all sorts of places and people think you're a photographer, so you've got a purpose for being there. Do you know what I mean? So
I agree. Music, practically any hobby. I think, yeah, a lot of people don't have hobbies nowadays. They don't do anything. I've got 1,000 hobbies because I've been mentally unwell for the past 35 years. Yeah. Anything that involves exertion, whether it be a sport.
Yeah.
I was a runner for 30 years.
I think those 5 interventions in those 5 short cameos in one film that Maren showed us, that's basically because of wherever that place was, or the particular interest of some pushy person, meant that some scheme was started. If I was working in a prison and wanted to do something therapeutic, it wouldn't be starting a Shakespeare theatre group. Clearly, there was somebody in that prison who thought that Shakespeare theatre groups were a big thing, or his big thing, and that's what got started. You can't, if you're in Wyoming, you can start a horse therapy thing. Can't do it on Branzome. Well, so I think a lot of those therapeutic interventions, I mean, it's like Lee's saying, almost anything is helpful in an environment like that. It just depends on what the environment is, what's around it, and what's available. But there are a couple of, well, there's a bloke called Dave Nicholson that I've been doing some work with, who's a probation officer who I haven't had an in-depth conversation with him about this, but he would talk to us if we wanted him to, about a couple of therapeutic communities that exist within the prison system. So the prison system doesn't talk about them because it doesn't particularly want to be expected to replicate them, because they are apparently highly successful in terms of less recidivism than just being in prison. But they don't, as I say, they don't get publicised very much. But there are a couple of sort of full-blown therapeutic communities within the prison system. Yeah, so there are all sorts. I mean, we kind of get the impression that there's nothing going on, but actually there's possibly more than we realise. But anyway, if people were interested in that, I could get this guy Dave to talk about that at some point.
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea, Andrew. Maybe he could come and give us a little bit of a talk on here one time.
Yeah,
perhaps.
Yeah. He's very occasionally in Hull. He's in Manchester. Lives in Manchester. He's very occasionally in Hull, or he could do it via Zoom, I suppose. But
yeah,
I think I've talked to Ella about it, but not the whole group. So I'll see if he's still willing and get him to make an offer. Yeah.
If no one's got to say, I'll say some bits and bobs. I've got a really argumentative head on tonight. I don't know what it is. I just feel like the ego is trying to separate me in all kinds of separate ways, and it's really interesting. Like, just trying to notice it, you know what I mean, and not trying to buy into the narrative of it. It's like, but like and I don't know where I'm coming from with this. I hope I'm not like being intentionally oppositional. But the old purpose thing got me, like, triggered me a little bit, because like what makes my meaning and purpose any less meaningful and purposeful than yours? So if I'm sat in a crack den smoking crack, committing crime, that's purpose. Like, how does it make it any more less purposeful and meaningful than just because you've decided to go out to work and be a slave to the capitalistic system? I know which one I'm grateful for. I'm grateful that I was sat in the crack then, we're not being a slave. But yeah, so the purpose thing got me a little bit, and also like the therapeutic interventions as well. You know, there is a lot going on, and like them 5 examples in the video, the rehabilitation video. Like we say, don't we, that prison's like, you know, a bad thing and stuff, but I wonder how many of them people you'd get to engage with them kind of programs if they was out in the community. I'm pretty certain, right, that the uptake would be a lot less in the community than it was for them types of people. And yeah, I've got a friend as well who runs a drama therapy sessions within the prison as well, and she manages to get life-term prisoners, particularly gang members, involved, and she sees great growth in them. But also, you know, there's the circle stuff as well, which is out in the community. But a lot of them think circles comes into play at the end of a very long prison sentence usually. And what I really like about circles is, and it relates to that Buto, you know, the dancing stuff, the self-empowerment stuff. Circles, like, we get around the individual and encourage them to start looking at their interests, looking at their hobbies, see what ignites them. But again, like, the uptake is very small, like the success rates and stuff. Like one guy we've been working with, you know, well, we're lucky that he's got out of bed, you know, he's like that classes as a success, you know, and it's just very slow and quite laborious. I've got to be really patient because I just want to get him by his head and go, fucking come on, man. But yeah, yeah, I can't think of any other examples though.
I often wonder though about, you know, I was thinking about purpose. I was thinking about a positive purpose. So I suppose for me, my main thing throughout my whole life, and it has to do with, I could easily have become a criminal and got into drugs really early, and it was something that kept me, because I couldn't have coped in prison if I'd ended up there, and I just couldn't, because my choices were get some education and try and get somewhere. I didn't think past 40 really, but you know, 20 years later, or I'd be in the gutter, and those were the choices. So, and we saw a film, I remember seeing a film when I was 12, and it was actually an anti-heroin film. It was horrific, this film, and it wasn't actually you saw the fall of a young man into, you know, living in squalor, feels really ill. He died of an overdose in the end on his own. And then they just treated his body like a piece of meat. And that was the bit that I didn't, you know, this disrespect of you as a body, you know, you've died. And that got me, because my mum and dad were both nurses. So it's like this thing about, my mum used to tell us stories about people dying. You know, they'd say, oh, I've got an appointment at 2 o'clock, and then they'd go, you know, and things like that. And, you know, like little whimsical stories about people dying. But this was like, you die and then you just get thrown in a morgue. And that was what put me off taking anything more than cannabis, really.
Mm.
They're all so addictive, and I just thought I am an addictive personality, so I really had to force, and having a strict upbringing, even though you rail against it, you know, you want to be this, you want to do that, but you know, in a sense, I am grateful that I was brought up very strict. And I think that, you know, the Chinese actually, because Britain had this business with China on with opium, didn't it? The big opium. When was it? The early 19th century.
Yeah,
Churchill. It was
it
part
was
of
the
the British.
1800s, wasn't it? The late 1800s.
Yeah, and China, because it was forced to produce all this opium for this market in Britain, for the laudanum, the you know, and cocaine, or I don't know, well, because a lot of the 19th century writers, poets, and the artists of the 20th century all influenced by drugs, you know,
Yeah.
cocaine. When I think about it, Freud, you know, he's been disgraced because all his theories were written under the influence of cocaine. So,
Yeah,
you know,
well,
how can you believe the psychiatric community when some of their leaders have been like, God, you know, what were they on when they developed these theories? And then they're trying to apply it, you know, to you. So it's like, it's
yeah, it is. It's interesting for sure. And
but the
like,
purpose, you see, the purpose of human beings, what is it? We have no purpose really. We're here to disrupt the planet because we're supposed to be the most intelligent. So we have to organize ourselves into, well, what is best for the group, for us all together, unless we live as individuals or we band together for a common, decent purpose, you know, not just for a fight every month, you know, for money, or a fist fight, because that is part, you know, fighting dogs, fighting people put money on it, you know. When I see a bulldog, I often think, is that been used to fight with, you know? And it's about having a purposeful life that has got a spirituality to it. So whether it's Buddhism, and I think meditation, actually, they have done studies on, you know, like do 2 minutes of meditation before each lesson, primary schools, and that's actually cut down a lot of the hyperactivity, whether from ADHD or from fizzy drinks and sweets. And just taking 2 minutes, and this is Sam Donaldson, his 3-minute meditation. You just sit there silently for 3 minutes. So, you know, you go into school quarter to 9, you do meditation for 3 minutes, you know. Well, you have assembly, then you have meditation. We used to have assemblies as well. So that's a way of all the school meeting together, a message. It was similar to when I worked at a call center. The manager would give us a sort of talk, 8:30 in the morning. Right, we're doing this today. This is the mission statement for today. And the assembly did the same thing. You know, it was about, I don't know how long it was, 15 minutes. We had a hymn, we had a headmaster's talk, we had the successes of the school, whether someone had won a race or a football match, a cricket match. We had to fight to get the netball results in, but, you know, it was like, oh, yeah, bit of a clap, bit of a sing. Off to the lesson, the first lesson, you know, we were awake, basically. And yeah, I just think that positive thing at the beginning of the day, or positive messages throughout schools, but interaction where everybody is brought together in some way. I mean, people have banned assemblies because they say, well, they're too religious, Christian, but you could just have a meeting, you know, you just meet together and you meditate and you think of, I don't know, you just hope everyone's going to have a good day, you know, just like we do, a check-in before you have the meeting. So a check-in before you go to your work, you know, if hospital staff, you come in, right, we're going to sit in the office and just have a minute of just before we go on to do this intense work that we're going to do, you know, just anger management is dealing with the issues of abuse and trauma, but also learning strategies in how to contain it, but having outlets for the release of testosterone, of you know, the need to move, the need to feel our bodies, feel us in it, you know, going swimming in the Greeks in Great Yarmouth, New Year, every Greek boy is in the water. Some of the girls do it as well, as they're brave, in the water, and they throw this giant cross into the sea. And some boy has some, it's usually a boy actually. I think a girl did it one year. That was like, oh, what do we do? The Greek Orthodox Church. So, and I remember going down one day watching it all go in the water. It's this big celebration. And then one boy comes out with the cross, you know, it's like, it's an assault course, you know, it could be done in anything. You could throw, I don't know, throw something else in the sea, you know, a Buddha, or you could throw a tree trunk or something.
Can I just say, I've got to go. I've got somebody ring me at 8 o'clock, so I'm going to.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for your presence. I love you very much. Speak soon.
And you. Bye.
Bye.
Yes, so right, that's 8 o'clock, guys. If has anyone got out to add, it looks like Catherine and Merrin have possibly left. I'm not sure.
I'm here. Just
hi,
yeah.
Hi, Merrin. Has anyone else got anything to add?
No, good meeting though. Been very interesting. It's been good. Good to see you all.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Lee. And I think it was Andy, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we exchange emails about the next meeting? Does anybody have any preference about what they want to talk about? I can get some materials together. Do we think we have a gap in knowledge? Is there something that we should know as a group, but we don't know? Something like that. Just whatever, really.
Well, do you know anything about I think native cultures is the right term.
Yeah.
And how they operate with justice and stuff. Because
yeah,
they definitely don't build prisons. So I'd love to know what if they have anything, like what, like
restorative justice.
What's that?
Restorative justice. This is also something Ella wanted to know more about, but we never had a Zoom call about it, just dedicated to that. But I mentioned, I think in a previous Zoom call, I think to Ella, I can put some materials together or a lecture, and then we can discuss this. Oh yeah, there it is. The Maori ones in New Zealand, I think, originate this idea of restorative justice, or circles. So people sit in a circle, kind of like what we do when we meet in person, and they talk about the harms that the offender caused the whole community, not just the direct victim, but then they offer to fix that harm according to what the victim thinks the offender should do. So it's called restorative. No one is locked up, but no one escapes responsibility either. So yeah, we could talk about that next time properly, because we kind of mentioned it, but
yeah, I've heard of that. I've just remembered I went on a course with this woman called Dr. Natalie Tobert, and she is, I'm not sure if anyone knows her, but it's back to front, but it's cultural perspectives on mental well-being, and it's spiritual interpretations of symptoms in medical practice that goes across different cultures.
Yeah.
And I have yet to read it all, but she does do webinars as well. And,
yeah.
It's about different people have different spirits, because you know, not everybody's Christian or Muslim or and it does deal a bit, but it's written from a North American, you know, because she's American, so she's written about the Native American Indian traditions as well, and different other sort of cultures. So I thought that might be interesting to look at the ways that spirituality is seen differently and how mental illness in different settings is seen, and to make it into, you know, I have seen books which talk about, say, autistic people being it's a super gift or something, you know, like if you see your
like where I come from, for example, a lot of the population relies on the supernatural beliefs, and they think it's a disruption in your spiritual sort of well-being. Some of them think it's something that God can cure. So the medicalization is not, I think, is predominantly a Western thing, and you know, it has some merit, but it's not holistic enough. You're right. But one thing that shocked me about restorative justice is it's usually for minor offenses. But in the Congo, I was so shocked to see in Central Africa, the victims of, because you know how they have ethnic conflict and one ethnicity tries to commit genocide against another, and the victims of the genocide, the surviving victims, decided there are too many offenders to put in prison. We're going to forgive them, and we're going to sit in a circle and talk about the harm that they caused us. And I just think that is such an excessive, violent act to forgive without, I don't know, I was so shocked to see that. But I'll organize little videos like short videos like that. We can talk about why we perhaps can't do that, at least for minor offenses here.
Yeah, they did it in Rwanda, because they had that big civil, you know, the Tutsis and the Hutus, and that was pure, oh, that was dreadful. But actually, again, the numbers, and it was the women who, because a lot of women were raped and things like that.
Yeah.
They had to, and produce children as well from rape. So like, how do you deal with that? And you've got children. Africa does not, it doesn't disown children, do you know what I mean? Easily. So you have to sort of find a solution to, and I know in South Africa they had a lot of restorative talks when they, you know, when apartheid was dismantled, to ease in some sort of government, you know. So those things have been used in terms of it seems like extremes, genocide or minor. So somewhere in the middle, how can you use it in a more sort of I did see an exhibition actually in Trinity Church in Leeds once, and they did it was like an exhibition of restorative justice, and it was really interesting because there was even rapists who met with their it's only on, you know, they would both have to agree. But there is an issue with, if you don't forgive, you end up with a lot of hatred, don't you? So and bitterness, which sometimes can impede mental health as well. But it is hard to, you can't, maybe it's like not forgetting. This is the level we can descend to if we don't work to get, you know, like, I mean, the Holocaust, there's so many examples of people just slaughtering someone else because they've demonized them and said they're cockroaches, in the case of Nigeria and the Igbos and the Europe, you know, it's just the Scots and the English. We've got this capacity to be really nasty on a national level as well.
Yeah, very much so. And the types of victims that forgive those types of crimes, I just find it hard to understand, but the will is available in certain populations.
I think the Rwandan women, and they had to get the men on board as well, because it's, you know, if rape is mainly an issue. So the men had to educate the men, and they set up this whole thing. It was in, I can't remember where I saw it actually, but it's something to do, maybe the UN was involved, I don't know, or something. It's
videos together maybe for next time, if that's what everybody wants, but I'm happy to take ideas.
I think maybe some stuff on what's going on at the moment and what's working, what initiatives are happening in prisons, in schools as well, like there's anti-bullying, anti-knife campaign, you know, there's There's a lot of. I saw an exhibition in Sheffield actually on knife crime, and that was done by a school in Sheffield. Oh, no,
Yeah.
it's from Newcastle. The exhibition was from Newcastle, so it's about knife crime and how they were dealing with it.
Yeah, so we could do both. We could do a short discussion on restorative justice and then what is working now and what isn't working and where restorative justice might work if we invested in that a bit more. It's talked about a lot, but I don't know if we invest in it. I mean, we're doing youth justice, but then you have a lot of young people being let down at the same time. So I'll explore that.
I've got a film that we could watch as well called Hollow Water, and it's about like indigenous community justice in, I think it's North America. I don't know where exactly, but yeah, that sounded really good. And that was for like I think it was like child sex abuse and stuff. So yeah, quite intense, but I've got a link to a film and it's free, so maybe we could put that in the thing.
Yeah.
List of things to watch as well. But yeah, like it feels good to like, because the things that you shared about the therapeutic interventions and stuff, like, yeah, it'd be good to look more. I guess there's just like so much to look at and so much to learn about, and
Yeah.
so much in terms of like more community-led approaches as well. So yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah, it's certainly something. Yeah, I'm very interested in restorative justice, and so that'll be good. That'll be interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's one of the most humane things you can do, isn't it? In other words,
Yeah.
yeah. So that'll be interesting. I'm still recording, by the way, so I don't know. Let me know when I can stop.
Cool.
Yeah. Thanks for the meeting again. I think I'm gonna head off actually.
Yeah. Nice one.
Take care. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks everyone. See you, Lee.